That thumbnail did not age well. The Age of War Chapter 3 was heralded as the grand ending to the Age of War, where our work against the Stygian army would come to a head with a full frontal assault on their fort, alongside bringing in new quest hub mechanics with the Tavern System. However, not much went to plan in this chapter. What went wrong? Well, we're going to go through all the ugly details today, any of the redeeming features, and of course we'll be giving the entire chapter a rating. So, without further ado, let's get started. Launch day is always the most important day for any update, and, ironically, sometimes the worst. Launching anything always has a risk of new bugs being found, but oh boy, this launch had a big one. So the update drops, people log in, and they're banned. Yeah. What happened was that people were effectively banned for what the internal currency system thought was an invalid payment transaction, rendering virtual currencies of Crom coins invalid. Basically, from my understanding, this function likely would have been used for people that would attempt to fraudulently issue a chargeback after buying Crom coins, or maybe also for those that use stolen credit cards and such, but it hit a lot of people, the vast majority of whom were not fraudsters in the slightest. Some people also had Crom coins mistakenly deducted to make up for the difference in unpaid currency that the system thought had been fraudulently purchased. Now, I was quite lucky in that I wasn't hit by this, but a lot of people were, both regular players and content creators included. I'm not sure exactly how many people were affected, but it was a lot, and to be honest, one was far too many. Funcom were aware of this issue within the first half an hour and were fairly quick to fix the rolling nature of the bug, meaning it couldn't continue to mistakenly ban people. Those that remained banned or lost Crom coins would still have to contact Zendesk support, and though some people reported Zendesk were really fast with them, it still understandably flooded the system. Funcom did also enable holiday season decay timers to try to prevent people losing in-game resources, and rolled out a process on their end to unban as many people as possible, though it did not fix the issue for everyone. Zendesk did manage to get through the tickets, and whilst I'm unaware of exactly how long it took, there were definitely some days there after launch where a not insignificant portion of the player base were just unable to access the game. Terrible launch, to be frank, and, unfortunately, there are more issues ahead. The Siege of Al Mariah was the big flagship content drop with this chapter, and unfortunately, it didn't quite live up to the hype, at least not for me. The structure was impressive for sure, and the varying approaches you could take to besiege it did feel very open and freeform, but the performance in and around the fort was terrible. I went into this more in a dedicated video at the time. I was pulling incredibly low FPS on high and even medium settings, and had to drop to the low preset to get close to playable. This is something I've seen many other people report on all platforms. The rewards were decent, though it generally felt like there was just little reason to explore the castle or do anything much aside from climb up to the boss room, kill him and take the loot there. People also reported strange wave behaviour where enemies just kept on spawning, and generally the execution just wasn't there. The siege was also not available on Siptar. I kinda thought that would be a given, seeing as the siege is tied to the Exile Land story, but I know people would have wanted to have it on that map. There was talk of porting it over to Siptar, but I think in the end they've gone for new destructible camps in the Age of War Chapter 4. I think a lot of people wanted to like the siege as it is such a unique idea, but it just wasn't as good as it should have been. In retrospect, I think it would have been better as an instanced area to reduce performance load, and the rewards should have just been better spread throughout the castle to encourage exploration and different tactics, as anyone looking for the maximum reward would just beeline straight for the uppermost boss room. Overall, in my estimation, Al Mariah was not that great. It was fun the first time around, but considering the issues with performance in and around the fort, alongside the concentration of loot in a few select areas, it just didn't really feel like must-do content. There was also a change to combat that likely played a big part in how the siege was received, but we'll get to that later on. As a first try with the destructible camp system, I think it was a good venture, but I think had it been scaled back a bit and developed a little more, it would have landed a lot better. The second new addition has massive potential, and that was the Tavern System. You were able to rescue a new thrall from the Purge, a barkeep, and they would teach you how to build a tavern counter. Build it, slot them in, and you'll start to attract NPCs to your base. Some are just window dressing, but others are recruitable thralls, offering a new passive way to find thralls to add to your ranks. You could also bring contacts into your tavern, and whilst the only initial option was Iskar the mercenary captain from Chapter 2, this entire system is just ripe for expansion in the future, and by the sounds of it, it is what the devs want to build on in the future as a real linchpin of content development. Most people, myself included, love this idea. Your base in the world feels more alive, you can get thralls through an alternative route, and having a quest hub in your base is perfect. Now, the Tavern system wasn't a disaster as such, but there were issues that hampered it. Many reported that recruitable thralls were entirely too rare, which was something I also encountered, though it feels like those spawn rates might have improved after some hotfixes. Higher tier thralls were also very rare, though that was expected. Pixel Cave did a really good breakdown on the maths of this that I would advise watching if you're curious, but generally, the spawn rates of any recruitable thralls were a bit too low to be reliable. The second issue affected the barkeep, and that was that they were just harder to get than usual. I don't want to cannibalise the bugs section later on, so I won't expand on it too much here, but basically an issue with the Purge made the waves much harder to complete, thus making access to the barkeep harder, and the barkeep is of course the core foundational piece of the tavern. The Tavern system was pitched as, and honestly still has the potential to really revolutionise the game. After some hotfixes, I think it's settled into a somewhat nice space, and as it expands through the coming chapters and ages, I still think it very well could be one of the best additions ever made to Conan. However, the initial rarity of recruitable thralls and issues with acquiring a barkeep did add some friction into that system prior to the hotfixes, so the launch of it was not too great. That being said, the core system is still good and has a ton of potential. There are a couple of new Purge Defences in this update too, namely the Burning Siege Cauldron and the Archer Post. They're quite small additions that you can acquire through the Purge, and without touching on those issues at launch that made the Purge harder, these additions were alright. The Burning Siege Cauldrons could be manned by thralls, which was very nice to have, and the Archer Posts help with keeping your archers in place and organised. Fairly small additions, but I thought it was worth mentioning, and to be honest, I thought they were quite good. And now, as I mentioned earlier, the combat changes. These were not well received at all, and to be honest, for good reason. Chapter 2 introduced the ability for you to rotate during attack swings by just turning your camera, which to me felt really good, and then this update came and required a movement input to do the same. Additionally, changes were also made to enemy rotation, which resulted in a really clumsy feeling combat experience. It was unintuitive and even aggravating to a degree to fight fluidly with your character, and a fair number of enemies rotated way too harshly, sticking to you and making it near impossible to dodge their attacks. The worst part? The changes to attack rotation on the player character were intentional. This is being fixed in the upcoming Age of War Chapter 4 through a client-side toggleable combat option, and rotation on some of the biggest offending enemies is being reduced too, but from my perspective these changes were just not necessary. Some may feel differently, but to someone like me, who admittedly doesn't do combat all that often, fighting stuff in Chapter 2 felt pretty good. Chapter 3 was a slog though. Anytime I had to record combat B-roll it just felt very unintuitive and clumsy, and I really wasn't a fan of how it was executed. Whilst the option to revert back to the Chapter 2 style combat is coming in the next update, I don't really think there was any need to make these changes to rotating in combat. Again, they felt clumsy, they were incredibly poorly received, and in my mind, it just shouldn't have been done. And now we reach the bugs. Chapter 3 launched with a couple of big bugs, the first being the ban issue I mentioned earlier. The other issues, however, were issues with demolishers in the Purge, and with the camel mounts. The camel bug was pretty simple. You couldn't raise calves in the stables, and thus you couldn't actually get them as a mount without the admin panel. This was resolved in a mid-January patch, but considering this mount had been teased for a while and people were looking forward to it, having to wait for a hotfix just to access what should have been the update from the jump was not good. The Demolisher bug is what caused some issues with the Tavern system. The Demolishers, the big lads and ladies with battering rams, were dealing much more damage than intended to structures, often one or two shotting building pieces. Demolishers were already a priority target in the Purge, but considering they now did such insane damage, it made fighting the Purge a lot harder, and one mistake or one demolisher accidentally slipping through could easily destroy your doors, your floors, your coffer, etc. By making it harder to finish the Purge, it was therefore much more difficult to get your hands on the barkeep to build the tavern, or to get the recipes for the new defensive tools. This was also fixed in a mid-January patch, but considering one half of the big content drops relied on you running multiple Purges, not good. Additionally, the timing of Chapter 3 made these bugs worse. Chapter 3 dropped on December 14th, 2023, very close to the Christmas holidays for both the US and the Oslo offices. This meant that the mid-January patch to fix the pressing bugs was quite far away, with that time possibly eaten up even more by all the time dedicated to fixing the false ban bug. Overall, just not good in the slightest, really just a storm of bad bugs affecting the big content and terrible timing. Finally, over on the microtransactions front, it was a bit of a mixed bag. The battle pass was pretty good, and there were some welcome changes to speed up rotation times in the bazaar too. The Aesir extension set was actually quite good. The full Aesir building set is super flexible and really fun to use, and though there were reservations about extending a recent building set so quickly, I think most that used it had a pretty good time, myself included. On the other side, the dungeon extension was not great. The initial dungeon set was very restrictive and hard to use, and the extension didn't really help with that. Some parts did have a nice design to them, but generally the set was not cohesive, pieces literally didn't fit together, and the extension was not that good. You then also had Pillowgate. The Yamatai Tavern bundle had people excited to finally get some non-modded Japanese style decorations, and it promised to let you create a nice traditional style Japanese tavern, but it just all went wrong. $20 for this set was incredibly steep, especially considering the pillow seats didn't actually work as seats for thralls or players, you just had to emote on them. This was bad considering the promo images implied they were seating pieces, and the item description says they're commonly sat upon. The January hotfix then moved the floor pillow to the decorative section of the menu to, and I quote, avoid confusion about functionality. Associate Game Director Dennis then confirmed on the forums the pillows would be fixed, though not until Chapter 4, and presumably the move in category was a temporary one. Just disastrous. I can't help but laugh in a way. It's so stupid for a pillow to cause that much controversy, but rightfully so, people felt they'd been misled, and I agree, they were. Overall, a really mixed bag on the microtransactions front. The Battle Pass was focused on decoration roleplay within the tavern, which I thought was pretty good. The Aesir extension made that set a lot better. Dungeon was disappointing, and, well, Pillowgate. So, in conclusion, where does the Age of War Chapter 3 fall in the grand scheme of things? Well, in terms of numerical rating, my scale starts at 5 and I subtract or add points accordingly for bad and good. It's not overly mathematic, but that's generally just how it works. For context, my highest rating was 8 out of 10 for the Age of Sorcery Chapter 3, and my lowest was a 4.5 for the Age of War Chapter 1. This chapter was not completely irredeemable, there were some good aspects, but given the scale and number of issues in this chapter, and there were a lot of them, the Age of War Chapter 3 gets a 2.5 out of 10. A very disastrous launch, bugs that weren't able to be fixed for a month, a somewhat underwhelming flagship edition in the Fortress, a decent Tavern System initially marred by bugs, unnecessary changes that made combat feel clumsy, and a very mixed bag on the bazaar front made this chapter generally not that good, unfortunately. It seems this chapter was just the perfect storm of bad timing, launch issues, bugs, QA problems, etc, but going forward, are things going to actually change? Well, the devs have added a 4th chapter to every coming age to better space out the content and secure more time to not only develop features but presumably to invest in quality assurance. How that shakes out is yet to be seen, but if it plays out how they hope it will, then it should prevent some of those issues coming up again. I have no doubt that a big update every 3 months is a very rigorous schedule internally, but if that means the quality suffers as much as it did in this chapter, I don't think anyone's going to fault them for admitting so and taking steps to mitigate that hectic schedule. I think it's also worth noting that the Age of War Chapter 4 will be dropping after Easter, so they're not dropping that update before Easter, going off for their holidays and letting any bugs sit. I imagine that is a deliberate decision, and it's probably why we've got longer with that update on the public beta client too. Hopefully that is a trend that continues around holiday periods. The beta for Chapter 4 so far has shaped up pretty good. That update is again releasing fairly soon, so we'll be able to get a better measure of it when it does, and hopefully the launch is free of issues or controversy. I just want to enjoy the game and build stuff. Anyway, that about wraps up our review for the Age of War Chapter 3. Thanks for watching, and of course a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. I'm sure most will agree this chapter was not great in execution, but going forth, hopefully things will get better with the steps taken, though given the issues this time around, I think people will want to see that change manifest first. Again, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon.